Welcome to another episode of PropTech Part Talks. Today we are joined by Andrew Knight. Andrew, thank you for joining us today. I'll pass the mic over to you for the introduction.
Thanks very much. Yes, well, I spent the last 14 years working at RICS, the global professional body in the built and natural environment. Moved on from there literally about a couple of months ago, and now consulting and doing various advisory roles in the sector. And my focus has always been in the last 14 years working with participants in the built and natural environment, and increasingly with the data and technology sector, to see how the world of PropTech and digitization is impacting the sector.
Great. So let's rewind a bit. You studied geology at UCL, and now you're one of the leading voices on AI and data in real estate. What's the through line in that journey, and what pulled you towards this intersection of technology and the built world?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I did geology many years ago, but part of that degree was also computing, and then my career in the last couple of decades of the last century was very much in the commercial sector, but with a strong IT and technology focus. And if I go back far enough, when I first started using computers, they used things called punch cards, which I'm sure most of the listeners and viewers won't even have heard of. So I've been through a number of generations of IT and technology, in Salesforce automation, in manufacturing. And having spent the last 14 years at RICS, I've developed a deep and broad knowledge of that built and natural environment and all the practice areas. And so what I've eventually ended up doing is slamming together that IT technical knowledge with a pretty deep and profound understanding of the built and natural environment, and how those two sectors are really, at a very exciting inflection point at the moment.
Yeah, it's always fascinating how different disciplines feed into PropTech today. And speaking of transformation, real estate often talks about going digital, but progress can be patchy. What, in your view, are the biggest blockers of meaningful digital transformation in the property sector, and how do we move past them?
Yeah, I think there are a number of blockers, actually, and some of them are fundamentally structural, and some of them, as ever, come back to sort of human behaviours. I mean, if we think of the structural issue, and if I reflect on my career in manufacturing systems, real estate, so often projects and assets are kind of one-offs. There's a lot of bespoke work carrying on in the creation and management of assets. We also have a very fragmented sector. If we compare ourselves to perhaps things like aerospace or motor manufacturing, there are thousands and thousands of companies around the world involved in the different parts of the land and property life cycle. So you have that fragmentation, you have that kind of almost bespoke, heterogeneous nature of all the assets. You also have a very complex and long property life cycle over assets that last for a very, very long time, decades, centuries in certain circumstances. You also have, for better or for worse, I think a sector that's relatively conservative around change, hasn't necessarily historically invested in research and development, and perhaps critically hasn't really curated and managed data in a way that other sectors have. So I think you have a number of drivers there, or barriers around behaviours, the way data has been collected and managed over the years, the fragmented nature of the sector, the heterogeneous nature of the assets, and the incredibly long life cycle and complex life cycle of building, managing, developing, operating, ultimately refitting, demolishing buildings. So it's a very complex landscape. So I think digitization is clearly going to bring great benefits, but there are a number of challenges. And as ever, it also comes back to people and their appetite for change, perhaps their fear of change. So I think lots of factors there that have perhaps slowed down digitization in this particular sector.
Yeah, definitely. Like, all of these factors have to align. And you've been at the heart of initiatives at like the RICS data standard. And can you explain why data standards are so crucial, and what goes wrong when we ignore them in real estate?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because I did a lot of work at RICS when I created those data standards. In some respects, my views have evolved over the years, in the sense that one of the huge challenges, as I discussed earlier, about fragmentation, is that there are lots of different data sets out there, lots of existing standards. And my view increasingly, particularly with the emergence of AI and the ability of AI to interpret and translate data, is that whilst we do need a common language, a common lexicon of terms to understand the kind of attributes and features and values that we talk about when we talk about the built and natural environment. I think the idea of there being one common technical data standard, I think now is a chimera in that sense. So I think we need to work to is a common understanding of the kind of attributes, characteristics that we need to collect data on. And then we need to recognize that we need to use technology to translate from particular systems from one to another, to pull data out of documents, because so much of the data in the built and natural environment, back to your question about the barriers, is held effectively still in paper format. It might be a PDF, it might be a Word document, it might be a lease in some kind of digital form, but it's not necessarily structured data. So I think standards and thinking about the way we talk about the built environment is really important. But I think the idea that we can have one common technical data standard, I think is an illusion. I think we should use technology to help us move and translate and interpret data from different systems and some of those challenging formats that exist.
Talking about that, you've also written about automated valuation models, something that stirs debate in the valuation world. Where do you stand on the balance between human judgment and algorithmic valuation? We're moving toward, are we moving toward augmentation or automation?
I think it's a mix of both, and that's not to avoid your question, but back to that sense of how broad the different asset types are in real estate, in real property, from relatively homogeneous blocks of flats or properties that in a particular jurisdiction could be described as cookie cutter. In those kind of environments where you have good quality data, it's certainly possible to automate some form of valuation number, particularly from a kind of an underwriting or a portfolio type valuation basis. And bear in mind, when we talk about valuation, we're talking about valuation for a number of different purposes: taxation, secured lending, whatever that may be. So in certain circumstances with good quality data, with good quality algorithms, where the value is deemed to be perhaps an underwriting value or a part of an overall valuation of a portfolio, I think we can certainly look at automation by using good data, good algorithms. But once again, we need property professionals to help with the curation, the development of those systems, to calibrate them and make sure they're still producing good, statistically valid results. The more complex the asset, for different purposes of valuation, where you have judgment required, I think we'll be looking at augmentation. So I think depending on the use case, the asset, the purpose of valuation, we may be looking at a degree of automation. But in many cases, I will be thinking that we're looking at augmentation, helping human valuers to come to their conclusion. And bear in mind, it's not just automated valuation. AI and technology is being used to curate data sources, to produce information to put into valuation reports, to analyze data. So there's lots of other aspects in addition to simply producing a number, where automation can augment and help the valuer do their job. But I don't foresee a situation where there won't be human involvement, whether it's doing physical surveys, whether it's interpreting data. And I think critically, you need valuers, property professionals, to be that final human in the loop, to make sure that whether it's an automated system or an augmented system, they're there providing that professional judgment, and also acting as a challenge to what the model may be saying, a challenge to what the automation is saying, to check that that information is indeed correct and can be relied on.
Yeah, one complements the other, potentially, you can say.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Over your 14 years at RICS, you've led tech and data strategy during times of major change. What's one lesson you've learned about driving innovation within a legacy institution? The one thing you'd do differently?
I probably kind of think about two things, if I can cheat slightly. One of which is about making sure the organization puts in place a data strategy. Data is key to any kind of technology, particularly AI. So it's about changing mindsets around the data, to get the data right, to think about the internal data that they have, to think about the external data that they can utilize. And then ultimately, then it's about people, about change management. It's about getting sponsorship at the C-level, making sure also you get a culture of innovation all the way through the organization. And also, to some extent, don't try and boil the ocean. Start with some real business needs. Don't buy technology for the sake of technology. Think about things that you need to fix, that you can do better, that you can be more efficient at. So always be thinking, what's the business purpose of this digitization? Just don't use technology for technology's sake.
Yeah. So you don't just work in the built environment. The natural environment is a part of your scope too. How do you see tech and data helping us bridge the gap between ESG sustainable goals and the tangible action in property?
Yeah, I mean it's a key driver, obviously, for the built the built and natural environment, and we're very conscious. People myself working in the sector that we essentially start in many jurisdictions with green or brown fields, and we build on those, and we need to think about the biodiversity from that very early stage. We need to think about flood risk and other kind of risks that we need to mitigate, that we need to gather data on, and clearly over the full life cycle of the asset, we need to think about the whole carbon impact in terms of embodied and operational carbon. And as I say, that there are great tools out there now to understand land and land use. And bear in mind, from my time at RICS, many of our members were working in the rural sector, so there's a lot of exciting technology to help manage land use, to manage things like rewilding and the re-wiggling of rivers, to manage carbon offsets by tracking the growth of forests and mangrove, for example. So lots of areas where drone-based or satellite data can be analysed using AI to track those kind of things and to manage land and to manage crops. And then once you do develop and build assets, we do need to think about, clearly, the carbon footprint. We need to think about, once again, that biodiversity. So I think data and tech is critical in allowing us to have the data to manage our assets, to manage our developments, and manage our land in a much more sustainable way. So I think it's a critical thing to do. And sometimes people quite rightly focus on perhaps the carbon cost of using data and technology, but there are plenty of examples where there is a strong business case to not only absorb the cost of perhaps running technology, but to realise that the savings made in terms of carbon, whether that's building management or other kind of use cases, greatly outweighs the amount of water and energy you might be using and actually using technology. So we shouldn't be shy of using data and tech to solve some of these sustainability issues.
Yeah, that's powerful, especially as regulations tighten and stakeholders demand transparency. So let's end with a bit of future gazing. 10 years from now, what does property intelligence mean? What do you think we laugh at ourselves for not doing sooner?
I think we'll probably laugh at ourselves for not having taken care of the data that's so important. I think we'll move to a point where the industry is making decisions on facts rather than necessarily emotions and gut feel. And that's not to say that experience and judgment won't continue to be incredibly important. But I think we'll look back perhaps in a few years' time to realise how in many respects, how poorly we looked after the built environment, how poorly we gathered and curated data. If we think of, for example, in the UK, the recent instances around that concrete, which needs to be replaced, particularly in public buildings, I'm always very mindful that the built environment has not managed the data in the same way that, for example, motor manufacturing does. I have a car, and I recently had a letter from the manufacturer. My car's reasonably old, but still, based on that batch traceability, they knew there was a potential issue with the airbag on the driver's side. And so they were able to reach out because of the way they curate data, the way they, in arguably a more controlled environment, the way they can actually understand the particular components from particular batches that have gone in particular vehicles, particular built assets, as it were, and they can manage those in a way that we take for granted. And I would hope that kind of level of property information will be available. Digital twins and building passports. And in the UK market, for example, if you think of the impact of the Building Safety Act and the requirement now to manage data in various forms across the life cycle of that asset, particularly for that fire safety perspective, you see that direction of travel where we will look back and we will have high quality, up-to-date information around the assets in which we work, live and play that make them safer, better to manage, more sustainable. So I think that's what we'll look back on and think, why didn't we record and curate the data in that way?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I hope that we take that as a message and so that we don't regret later. Andrew, thank you for helping us rethink the foundations, and thank you for sharing your insights. And to our listeners, keep tuning in and learning and updating yourself on PropTech. Until next time.